My name is Mustafa Ali Farouk, and I need to tell you my story. I'm sitting here today in a place I cannot name, in a country far from the one where I was born. Sometimes I still can't believe how much my life has changed. Sometimes I look at my hands and remember when these same hands held the Quran during prayers, when I stood before rows of young men in our mosque, leading them in recitation. My father would watch from the back, his eyes filled with pride. I was his son, the Imam's son. And in our community in Cairo, that meant everything. I want you to understand something before I go any further. I loved my father, I still do, and I loved the life I had, or at least I thought I did. This isn't a story about a rebellious young man who wanted to hurt his family or disrespect his faith. This is a story about questions I couldn't silence, about a thirst I couldn't quench, about a door I didn't even know existed until it opened in front of me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to how it all began.
Hello, viewers from around the world. Before Mustafa continues his story, we'd love to know where you are watching from, and we would love to pray for you in your city. Thank you, and may God bless you as you listen to this powerful testimony.
I was born in a small neighborhood in Cairo, the kind where everyone knows everyone else's business. Our apartment was modest, but it sat above the mosque where my father served as imam. From my bedroom window, I could hear the call to prayer 5 times a day. That sound was the rhythm of my entire childhood. Before I could read, I was memorizing Quranic verses. Before I understood what the Arabic words meant, I knew how to recite them perfectly. My father, Imam Hassan Ali Farouk, was not a famous man. Our mosque was small, tucked between a fabric shop and a pharmacy on a narrow street that smelled like diesel and fresh bread. But in our neighborhood, my father was respected. When he walked through the market, men would stand to greet him. When he spoke, people listened. And I was his eldest son, his hope, his legacy. From the time I was 7 years old, I knew what was expected of me. I would follow in my father's footsteps. I would become a scholar of Islam, a leader in our community, perhaps an imam myself one day. This wasn't just my father's dream, it was mine too. Or so I believed. I wanted to make him proud. I wanted to see that look in his eyes, the one that said I had done well, that I was worthy of the family name. By the time I was 16, I was already helping lead the youth prayers. I knew the Quran better than most men twice my age. I fasted every Ramadan without complaint. I prayed my 5 daily prayers, sometimes more. When other young men my age were sneaking out to smoke or chase girls, I was in the mosque studying hadiths with my father. People in our neighborhood would point me out to their sons as an example. My mother would smile when she overheard these conversations, and my father would place his hand on my shoulder with a grip that spoke louder than words. I was the good son, the devoted son, the son who never questioned, never doubted, never strayed. But that's not entirely true. The first crack appeared when I was 19. It was Ramadan, and our neighborhood was alive with the particular energy that comes during the holy month. The streets empty during the day as people fasted, then filled with celebration after sunset. I loved Ramadan. I loved the sense of community, the focus on prayer, the way even the most casual Muslims in our area would return to the mosque. But that year, something happened that I couldn't shake off. There was a young man in our neighborhood named Karim. He was maybe 25, but worked in his uncle's electronics repair shop. Karim wasn't particularly religious. He came to Friday prayers sometimes, but not always. He fasted during Ramadan, but people whispered that he drank alcohol. One evening during that Ramadan, someone claimed they saw Karim eating during the day, breaking his fast in secret. The news spread through our community like fire through dry grass. By the next day, everyone knew, and the judgment was swift and harsh. People who had greeted Karim warmly just days before now turned their backs when he passed. His uncle publicly shamed him in the mosque. And my father, when asked about it during a Friday sermon, used Karim as an example of how far one can fall when faith is weak. I watched Karim after that. I saw how he walked through our neighborhood with his head down, how he looked like a man carrying stones on his shoulders, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. Where was the mercy? Where was the forgiveness? If Allah is most merciful, most compassionate, why did it feel like our community had none of that mercy to offer? I tried to push the thoughts away. I told myself that judgment was necessary, that Islam demands accountability, that sin must be addressed. But the questions lingered, especially at night when I couldn't sleep. More questions came after that, not all at once, but slowly, like water finding cracks in a wall. I began to notice how much of my religious practice was driven by fear. Fear of hell, fear of Allah's anger, fear of disappointing my father, fear of what people would think. Even my prayers felt less like a conversation with God and more like duty I had to perform correctly or face consequences. I would see my father pray, his forehead touching the ground, and I would wonder, does he feel close to God, or is he like me, just following the rules? I couldn't ask him these questions. How could I? He was the Imam. He was supposed to have all the answers, and I was supposed to be following his path without hesitation. When I was 20, I tried to find answers on my own. I read more Islamic texts. I listened to lectures by famous sheikhs online. I attended special classes at a larger mosque across the city. I was searching for something that would fill this growing emptiness inside me, this sense that I was performing religion but not living it. But the more I learned, the more questions I had. Why did certain hadiths contradict each other? Why were there so many rules about small things but such harsh interpretations of major things? Why did it feel like the message was always about what I couldn't do, what I shouldn't think, what would anger God? I remember one night I was alone in my room after midnight. My family was asleep. The city outside was quiet except for the occasional car passing by. I had just finished my night prayers, but I remained on my prayer mat, staring at the wall, and I felt absolutely nothing. No peace, no connection, no presence of God, just emptiness. I put my face in my hands and I asked a question I had never dared to ask before, even to myself. What if I am doing all of this and God still feels far away? What if there is supposed to be more than this? The question terrified me. It felt like betrayal. It felt like the first step towards something dangerous. So I pushed it down, buried it, tried to forget I had ever thought it. But you can't unthink a thought. You can't unknow a question once it has formed in your mind. The pressure to maintain appearances became suffocating. Every Friday I would sit in the front row of the mosque during my father's sermon. I would nod at the right moment, say Amen with conviction, keep my face composed and serious. After prayers, men would greet me warmly, shake my hand, ask my father when I would begin leading more prayers. My father would smile and say I was still learning, still preparing. But soon, that word followed me everywhere. Soon you will be ready. Soon you will take on more responsibility. Soon you will be the example for the next generation. But inside Pegambrua, I felt like I was drowning. I started having trouble sleeping. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of Cairo at night. The distant horns, the dogs barking, the occasional voice from the street below. And in that darkness the questions would come flooding back, stronger each time. Is this all there is? Fear and obligation and endless rules? Why do I feel so empty when I'm doing everything right? Where is the love in all of this? That last question was the most dangerous one. Love. I realized I had never thought of my faith in terms of love. I thought of it in terms of duty, submission, obedience, fear. But love, that seemed almost irrelevant. I tried to talk to some friends about my feelings, but carefully, without revealing too much. I would ask questions like, don't you ever wonder if there's more to our faith than what we're taught? Or, do you ever feel close to Allah when you pray? The responses were always the same. Either they looked at me with confusion, as if the questions themselves were strange, or both, or they would quote something from the Quran or a hadith, as if that settled everything. No one seemed to have the same questions I had, or if they did, they weren't willing to talk about them. I felt completely alone. There was one conversation with my father that I'll never forget. It was a Thursday evening, and we were sitting together in the mosque after evening prayers. Everyone else had left, and it was just the two of us in that quiet space. The lights were dim, and I could hear the traffic outside, muffled through the walls. My father was reading from a book of commentary, and I was supposed to be studying, but I couldn't focus. Finally, I worked up the courage to ask him something that had been bothering me. I asked him if he ever had doubts, if he ever questioned things, if faith ever felt difficult for him. He looked up from his book, and for a moment I thought I saw something in his eyes. Surprise maybe, or concern, but then his face settled back into that calm, authoritative expression he always wore. He told me that doubt was a test from Shaitan, from Satan. He said that the righteous man doesn't entertain doubt, but crushes it with faith. He said that questions are fine when you're young, but eventually you must simply submit. That's what Islam means. He reminded me. Submission. Then he asked me if there was something specific I was struggling with. His voice was gentle, but there was a warning underneath it. I could feel it. This was not a safe space to share my real questions. So I lied. I told him I was fine, just tired from studying. I said I had been thinking about theological matters. Nothing serious. He seemed satisfied with that answer. He put his hand on my shoulder and reminded me that I was his bride, that I was doing well, that he trusted me. That conversation haunted me for weeks. He trusted me. But I was lying to him. I was lying to everyone. I was standing in that mosque leading prayers while feeling like a fraud. I was memorizing verses I didn't fully believe anymore. I was becoming everything my father wanted while dying inside. I thought about leaving, just packing a bag, and disappearing into Cairo's massive streets. But where would I go? What would I do? I had no skills outside of religious studies. I had no friends outside our community, and even if I could survive physically, how could I live with the shame? How could I face the knowledge that I had destroyed my family's honor, broken my father's heart, abandoned everything I had ever known? So I stayed, and I pretended, and the emptiness grew. It was around this time that I started having a recurring dream. In the dream, I was in the mosque, but it was empty and dark. I was trying to pray, but I couldn't remember the words. I would open my mouth, but nothing would come out. And I could hear my father's voice calling my name from somewhere far away, but I couldn't find him. I would wake up from these dreams with my heart pounding, covered in sweat. I didn't tell anyone about the dreams. What would I say? That the mosque felt like a prison in my sleep? That I was losing the ability to pray, even in my subconscious? These were not things the Imam's son could admit. I turned 21 in December. My birthday came and went with little fanfare. My mother made my favorite meal. My younger siblings gave me small gifts. My father reminded me that this was an important year, that I was becoming a man, that soon I would begin taking on real leadership responsibilities in the mosque. I smiled and nodded and thanked them, but inside I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, and any moment I might fall. I had no idea that everything was about to change. I had no idea that the answer to my questions was coming in a way I never could have imagined. I had no idea that the very thing I had been taught to fear and reject my entire life would become the thing that finally gave me peace. All I knew was that I was desperate, desperate for truth, desperate for something real, desperate for a faith that was more than rules and fear and empty ritual. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I knew I needed something more than what I had. And that desperation, that hunger, that willingness to admit I didn't have all the answers, that's where my real journey began. It was late at night, sometime in January. I was lying in my bed, unable to sleep again. My Quran sat on the shelf next to me, and I stared at it in the darkness. I had read that book cover to cover dozens of times. I had memorized huge portions of it, but I realized, lying there in the dark, that I didn't know God. Not really. I knew rules, I knew theology, I knew rituals, but I didn't know God. And more than anything in the world, I wanted to know God. I didn't pray in Arabic that night. I just spoke quietly, in my own language, in my own words. I said something like, "If you are real, if you are there, if there is more than what I've been taught, please show me. I'm willing to lose everything to find the truth. Just please, show me." It felt reckless saying those words. It felt dangerous. It felt like I was opening a door that I might not be able to close. But I meant every word. I had no idea that within weeks a scratchy radio broadcast would lead me to that door. I had no idea that a book I had been taught to never touch would become the answer to every question I had been asking. I had no idea that the cost of finding truth would be higher than I could imagine, but that it would be worth every single sacrifice. All I knew that night was that I was ready, ready for whatever came next, ready to follow truth wherever it led, even if it led me away from everything I had ever known. I was ready, and God, in His mercy, was about to answer the prayer of a desperate young man who just wanted to know Him. It happened on a Wednesday night in February. I need you to understand how ordinary this moment was. There was nothing dramatic about it, nothing that seemed significant at the time. I was just lying in my bed, restless as usual, unable to sleep. The apartment was quiet except for the sound of my father snoring from the next room. Cairo hummed outside my window with its endless traffic and distant voices. I had an old radio that my uncle had given me years ago. Sometimes I would listen to it late at night when I couldn't sleep, usually tuning into stations that played Quranic recitation or Islamic lectures. The repetitive sound would sometimes help me drift off. That night, I reached for the radio almost without thinking, just wanting some noise to fill the silence in my head. I turned it on and began scanning through the frequencies. Static, more static. A pop song, a news broadcast, more static. I was about to give up when suddenly the static cleared, and I heard a voice speaking in Arabic. But it wasn't Quranic recitation. It wasn't an Islamic lecture. The voice was calm and warm, and he was talking about forgiveness. Not the kind of forgiveness I was used to hearing about, where you do good works to balance out your bad deeds, where you hope your good outweighs your bad on the day of judgment. This was different. He was saying that God had already provided complete forgiveness as a gift, that we couldn't earn it or deserve it, that it was freely given through someone named Isa al-Masih, Jesus the Messiah. I should have turned it off immediately. I knew this was a Christian broadcast. Everything in my training told me this was dangerous, that I shouldn't listen, that this was corruption and lies. My hand moved toward the dial to change the station, but I didn't turn it off. Something in that voice, or maybe in the message itself, held me there. The man was talking about how God is not distant, not waiting to judge and punish, but actually pursuing us with love. He used a word I had heard before but never really understood: agape, divine love, unconditional love. Love that doesn't depend on what we do or don't do. I listened for maybe 15 minutes that first night. My heart was pounding the entire time. I kept the volume low, terrified someone might hear. Every few minutes I would look at my door, expecting my father to burst in and catch me. But the apartment stayed quiet. When the broadcast ended, I quickly turned off the radio and shoved it under my pillow. I lay there in the darkness, my mind racing. What I had just heard contradicted everything I had been taught. Christians were people of the book, yes, but they had corrupted the truth, changed the scriptures, committed shirk by making Isa into God. This is what I had always been told. But something about what I had heard felt true, or at least it felt like something I needed to investigate. I didn't sleep well that night. When I finally drifted off, I had confused dreams about light and voices and doors opening. The next day, I went through all my normal routines: morning prayers, breakfast with my family, studies with my father, afternoon prayers at the mosque. But my mind was somewhere else. I kept thinking about that radio broadcast, about the things that voice had said, about forgiveness as a gift, about God's love, about Isa. I told myself I wouldn't listen again. It was dangerous and foolish. But when night came and I was alone in my room again, I found myself reaching for that radio. I tuned back to the same frequency, and after a few minutes of music, the same program came on. That night, the speaker was reading from something he called the Injil, the Gospel. I realized he was reading from the Christian scriptures, the Bible. Again, everything in me said I should turn it off, but I couldn't. The words he was reading were beautiful and strange and completely different from anything I had heard before. He read about Isa healing people, about him touching lepers that everyone else avoided, about him showing mercy to prostitutes and tax collectors, about him saying that he came not for the righteous but for sinners, about him claiming to be the light of the world. I listened to that broadcast every night for 2 weeks. I was careful, always keeping the volume low, always listening for footsteps in the hallway. During the day, I would think about what I had heard the night before. I started having questions that I knew I couldn't ask anyone. If Jesus was just a prophet, why did he claim to forgive sins? Only God can forgive sins. If the Christian scriptures were corrupted, why did these words have such power? Why did they seem to answer the very questions I had been asking? I knew what I needed to do, but I was terrified to do it. I needed to read the Bible for myself. Getting a Bible in Cairo when you're the Imam's son is not simple. I couldn't just walk into a bookstore and buy one. I couldn't ask anyone I knew, and I certainly couldn't order one online and have it delivered to my house. I spent days trying to figure out how to get one without anyone finding out. Finally, I remembered that there was a small church in a different neighborhood, far from where we lived. I had passed it once or twice when visiting a friend who lived in that area. It was a Coptic church, and I knew that Christians sometimes gave out Bibles. It took me another week to gather the courage to go. I chose a Friday afternoon when I knew my father would be at the mosque for hours. I told my mother I was going to the library. Then I took a bus to that neighborhood, my heart pounding the entire way. The church was smaller than I expected, tucked away on a side street. I stood outside for a long time, just staring at it. I felt like I was about to commit a crime. What if someone saw me? What if someone from our neighborhood happened to be in this area? What if my father somehow found out? But my hunger for truth was stronger than my fear. I walked through the door. Inside it was quiet and cool. There were a few people sitting in the pews, praying silently. No one looked at me. There was an older man near the entrance, arranging some books on a table. I approached him slowly. I must have looked terrified because he smiled gently at me before I even said anything. I asked him, my voice barely above a whisper, if I could have a Bible in Arabic. He didn't ask me any questions. He didn't make me explain why I wanted it. He just reached under the table and pulled out a small paperback Bible. He handed it to me and said something I will never forget. He said, "God bless you on your journey." I took the Bible, shoved it into my bag, and left quickly. The entire interaction took less than 5 minutes, but my hands were shaking. I couldn't take the Bible home. If anyone found it, my life would be over. So I hid it. There was a small storage room in our building where people kept old furniture and boxes. I found an empty box in the back corner, put the Bible inside, and covered it with some old newspapers. It wasn't a perfect hiding place, but it was the best I could do. That night, after everyone was asleep, I snuck down to the storage room. I had my phone for light. I opened that Bible and I started reading. I decided to start with the Gospel of John. I don't know why I chose that one. Maybe because the radio speaker had read from it several times. I sat on the concrete floor of that storage room, my phone light casting shadows on the walls, and I read. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. I stopped breathing. I read it again. The Word was God. And then a few verses later, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. This was claiming that Isa, Jesus, was not just a prophet, but was actually God in human form. This was the shirk I had been warned about my entire life. This was the unforgivable sin, attributing partners to Allah. But something in those words resonated deep in my soul. What if it was true? What if God had actually come down to us, not to judge and condemn, but to show us who He really is? I kept reading. I read about Jesus turning water into wine, about Him calming storms, about Him claiming to be the bread of life. I read His words, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Such exclusive claims, such bold statements. Either Jesus was exactly who He claimed to be, or He was a liar or a madman. But He couldn't be just a good prophet. Good prophets don't claim to be God. I read until my phone battery was almost dead. Then I carefully hid the Bible again and crept back upstairs to my room. I lay in bed, my mind spinning. Everything I had just read contradicted everything I had been taught, but it also answered questions I had been asking for years. Why do I feel so distant from God? Because maybe God isn't distant. Maybe He came close. Maybe He became one of us. Why is my religion all about fear and obligation? Because maybe true faith isn't about earning God's love. Maybe it's about receiving it. Why do I feel so empty despite doing everything right? Because maybe right actions without a right relationship mean nothing. Maybe God wants more than my obedience. Maybe He wants my heart. I started going to that storage room almost every night. I would wait until I was sure everyone was asleep. Then I would take my phone and go read. Sometimes for an hour, sometimes longer. I was devouring the words on those pages like a starving man finally finding food. I read the Sermon on the Mount, and I was struck by how different Jesus' teaching was from what I had learned. Blessed are the merciful. Blessed are the peacemakers. Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. This was radical, this was revolutionary. I read about Jesus eating with sinners and how the religious leaders condemned Him for it. I saw myself in those religious leaders, judging others from a position of supposed righteousness. I saw Karim, the young man from my neighborhood who broke his fast, and I felt ashamed of how our community had treated him. I read about the woman caught in adultery, how everyone wanted to stone her. But Jesus said, let him who is without sin cast the first stone. And then when everyone left, He told her, neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. Mercy before the judgment. It is love before law. I read the crucifixion story, and for the first time in my life, I wept reading a religious text. Not tears of fear or obligation, but tears of something I couldn't even name at the time. I read how Jesus died saying, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. He was forgiving the people killing Him. Even then, even there, and then the resurrection, Jesus rising from the dead, conquering death itself, offering eternal life not to those who earned it, but to those who simply believed. The more I read, the more everything in my Islamic understanding began to crumble. Not because someone was forcing me to doubt, not because I wanted to rebel, but because I was seeing truth clearly for the first time in my life. Islam had taught me that I needed to work my way to God. Christianity said God had worked His way to me. Islam had taught me that salvation was uncertain, dependent on my deeds being good enough. Christianity said salvation was certain, dependent on Jesus' work being perfect. Islam had taught me to fear God's judgment. Christianity taught me to receive God's love. I spent 3 months secretly reading that Bible, 3 months of sneaking down to that storage room reading by phone light, my heart pounding every time I heard a sound. 3 months of living a double life, leading prayers in the mosque by day, reading about Jesus by night, and slowly something was changing inside me. The emptiness was filling, the questions were finding answers, the distance I had always felt from God was closing. But with that change came growing conviction, and with conviction came an impossible decision. I couldn't keep living this lie. I couldn't keep pretending to be a devout Muslim when I was beginning to believe that Jesus was exactly who he claimed to be. I couldn't keep leading prayers to Allah when my heart was starting to cry out to Jesus. There was one verse that I kept coming back to over and over. It was in the Gospel of Matthew, words that Jesus spoke. Whoever acknowledges me before others, I will also acknowledge before my Father in heaven. But whoever disowns me before others, I will disown before my Father in heaven. I knew what this meant. If I truly believed, I couldn't hide it forever. Eventually, I would have to make a choice, continue the lie and lose my soul, or speak the truth and lose everything else. I tried to find a middle way. Maybe I could believe in Jesus secretly and still maintain my outward Islamic practice. Maybe I could have both. But I knew deep down that this was cowardice. Jesus himself said, "You cannot serve two masters." The moment of decision came on a night in late April. I had been reading the book of Romans and I came to chapter 10, verse 9. If you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. It was simple, clear, direct. Believe and confess. I sat there in that storage room, my phone light illuminating those words, and I knew the time had come. I couldn't wait any longer. I couldn't keep investigating, keep considering, keep debating with myself. I had to make a choice. I closed the Bible and I bowed my head. But this time I didn't bow toward Mecca. I didn't recite memorized prayers in Arabic. I just talked from my heart to the God I was finally beginning to know. I don't remember my exact words, but I know what I said. I told Jesus that I believed he was who he claimed to be. I told him I was sorry for my sins. I told him I was tired of trying to save myself, tired of performing, tired of fear and emptiness. I told him I needed him. I surrendered my life to him. I asked him to forgive me and change me and lead me. And in that moment, something happened that I cannot fully explain. I felt peace. Real peace, not the absence of problems, but the presence of someone that was stronger than all my problems. I felt like chains I didn't even know I was wearing had just broken off. I felt clean. I felt free. I felt found. I sat in that storage room and I cried. But these weren't tears of sadness or fear. These were tears of relief, of joy, of coming home after being lost for so long. When I finally went back upstairs to my room that night, I felt like a different person. The emptiness was gone. The questions were answered. I had found what I had been searching for. But I also knew that my problems were just beginning, because now I had to figure out how to live this new life in a world that would see it as betrayal. Now I had to figure out what to do with this truth that could cost me everything. I lay in my bed that night, no longer empty, no longer lost, but terrified of what came next, because I knew eventually I would have to tell my father. And when that day came, everything would change forever. I lived with my secret for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of waking up as a Christian and going to sleep as the Imam's son. 6 weeks of feeling joy I couldn't share and truth I couldn't speak. 6 weeks of the most intense internal conflict I have ever experienced. During those weeks, everything looked the same from the outside. I still led youth prayers at the mosque. I still studied with my father. I still went through all the motions of being a devoted Muslim. But inside, everything had changed. When I bowed in Islamic prayer, I was secretly talking to Jesus. When I heard my father's sermons, I was comparing them to what I had read in the Bible. When people congratulated my father on having such a righteous son, I felt like a fraud. The weight of the deception was crushing me. Every day felt like I was betraying someone. If I kept quiet, I was betraying Jesus, who had asked me to confess him before others. If I spoke up, I was betraying my family, destroying their honor, breaking my father's heart. I tried to find a way out. I researched online about Muslims who secretly believed in Jesus. I found stories of others who had converted, but most of them had either fled their countries or were living in constant danger. I looked for some way to soften the blow, some way to explain this to my father that wouldn't devastate him. But there was no easy way. No matter how I imagined the conversation, it ended in disaster. The person who kept me going during those weeks was someone I had never met in person. I had written to the Christian radio station, asking for advice. They connected me with a man named Boutros, who had also converted from Islam years ago. We communicated through an encrypted messaging app. He understood everything I was going through because he had lived it himself. Boutros told me something I will never forget. He said that Jesus never promised the truth would be easy. He promised it would be worth it. He said that the cost of following Christ is high, but the cost of rejecting him is infinitely higher. He encouraged me to pray for courage, to trust that God would be with me, and to be honest when the time came. The time came sooner than I expected. It was a Thursday morning in early June. The weather was already getting hot, the kind of heat that makes Cairo feel like an oven. I had barely slept the night before. I kept waking up with this overwhelming feeling that I couldn't keep living this lie. That morning, as I got dressed for prayer, I looked at myself in the small mirror in my room, and I barely recognized myself. I looked tired, stressed, older than 21, and I heard something in my heart, clear as a voice. Today, tell him today. I tried to push it away. I told myself to wait, to plan better, to prepare more. But the conviction only grew stronger. Today. My father and I usually studied together after morning prayers. That day, we were sitting in his small office in the mosque. Just the two of us. He was explaining a passage from a hadith, and I was supposed to be taking notes, but I couldn't focus. My hands were shaking. My heart felt like it was going to explode out of my chest. My father noticed something was wrong. He stopped talking and looked at me with concern. He asked if I was feeling sick, if I needed to go home and rest. And in that moment, I knew I had to speak. If I didn't do it now, I might never have the courage again. I took a deep breath and I said I needed to tell him something important. The look on his face shifted from concern to alertness. He set down his book and gave me his full attention. He probably expected me to confess some minor sin, some struggle with temptation, something we could address and move past. I don't remember my exact words, but I know what I said. I told him I had been questioning my faith for a long time. I told him about the emptiness I had felt, the questions I couldn't answer. I told him about finding the Christian radio broadcast, about reading the Bible app, about discovering Jesus. And then I said the words that would change everything. I believe Jesus is the Son of God. I believe He died for my sins and rose from the dead. I am a follower of Christ now. The silence that followed felt like it lasted for hours, though it was probably only seconds. My father just stared at me, his face completely frozen. I couldn't read his expression. Confusion, disbelief, shock. Then he laughed. Not a real laugh, but that sound people make when something is so absurd they don't know how else to react. He said I must be joking, that this must be some kind of test or trick. He asked if someone had put me up to this. I shook my head. I told him I was serious. I told him this wasn't a joke. The smile disappeared from his face, and I watched my father transform before my eyes. His confusion turned to anger. His shock turned to rage. He stood up from his chair so fast it fell backward. He started shouting, asking me if I had lost my mind, if I understood what I was saying. If I knew what this meant, he told me to take it back, to say I was confused, that I had made a mistake, that I didn't mean it. He was giving me a way out, a chance to undo what I had just done. But I couldn't take it back. I couldn't pretend I didn't believe what I believed. So I said nothing. I just looked at him with tears starting to form in my eyes, and my silence was all the answer he needed. What happened next is difficult for me to describe even now. My father, this man who had always been controlled and dignified, who had always spoken with measured authority, completely lost himself. He began pacing back and forth in that small office, his hands gripping his head. He was shouting things I had never heard him say, his voice cracking with emotion. He asked me how I could do this to him, how I could betray everything he had taught me, everything he had sacrificed for me. He asked me if I had any idea what this would do to our family, to his reputation, to his position in the community. He asked me if I understood that I was choosing hell over paradise, choosing lies over truth. I tried to speak, to explain, but he wouldn't let me. Every time I opened my mouth, he would raise his voice louder, cutting me off. He said I had been deceived by Christian missionaries, that I was too young and foolish to understand what I was doing, that the devil himself had gotten into my mind. Then he demanded to know how long this had been going on. How long had I been lying to him? How long had I been pretending to pray while secretly worshipping Jesus? When I told him it had been a few months, something broke in him. He stopped pacing and just stared at me with this look of absolute horror. He said he didn't know me, that the son he thought he had, the son he had been so proud of, didn't exist, that I had been a stranger living in his house, a deceiver, a hypocrite. Those words cut deeper than any knife could have. He told me to get out of the office, to go home, that he needed time to think, to pray, to decide what to do with me. I stood up on shaking legs and walked toward the door. As I reached for the handle, I heard him say one more thing, his voice now quiet and cold. "You have killed your mother. I went home in a daze. I don't remember walking through the streets. I don't remember climbing the stairs to our apartment. The next thing I clearly remember is sitting in my bed, staring at nothing, waiting for what I knew was coming. My father came home 3 hours later. I heard his heavy footsteps on the stairs, heard him talking to my mother in the other room. Then I heard my mother gasp, heard her voice rise in panic. Within minutes, my entire family knew. My mother came to my room first. She stood in the doorway, her hand over her mouth, tears already streaming down her face. She asked me if it was true. I nodded. She let out a sound I had never heard from her before. Something between a cry and a moan, and she collapsed against the doorframe. My younger sister ran to help her, and both of them stood there sobbing. My brothers came next. One of them looked at me with pure disgust. The other looked confused, like he couldn't process what he was hearing. My youngest sibling, just 13 years old, asked me what was happening, why everyone was crying. And then the extended family started arriving. Word had spread with impossible speed. My father's brothers came, my mother's sisters came. Cousins and aunts and uncles filled our small apartment, and every single one of them looked at me like I had become a monster. The shouting started again, but now it was from multiple voices all at once. Everyone had something to say. How could I disgrace the family name like this? Didn't I fear Allah's punishment? Was I trying to destroy my father? Had I been bribed by Christians? Was I mentally ill? Some of them tried a different approach. They begged me to reconsider, to come back to Islam, to see reason. They promised me that if I recanted right now, if I said I had made a mistake, they would forgive me and we could all move forward. My grandmother, my father's mother, got on her knees in front of me and held my hands, crying, begging me not to do this to the family. It would have been so easy to give in, to say I was sorry, that I had been confused, that I had made a terrible mistake, to make all of this pain stop, but I couldn't, because I knew it would be a lie, and I had spent enough of my life lying. So I remained silent through all of it, tears running down my face, my heart breaking, but my conviction unshaken. As the evening went on, the crowd in our apartment thinned. People left angry, disappointed, disgusted. Eventually, it was just my immediate family and my father's 2 brothers. They all gathered in the living room to discuss what to do with me. I could hear them from my room, their voices angry and urgent. Some wanted to take me to a sheikh who specialized in spiritual warfare, convinced I was possessed by demons. Others wanted to lock me in my room until I came to my senses. My uncle suggested they take me to a doctor, that I must be mentally unwell. And I heard my father say something that chilled me to my bones, that the punishment for apostasy in Islam is death, and that while he couldn't carry that out himself, he would not protect me from others who might. Around midnight, my father came to my room alone. He had aged years in the span of one day. His eyes were red, his face was pale, and he looked broken in a way I had never seen. He sat down on the chair in my room, and we sat in silence for several minutes. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and hollow. He said he had given me life, raised me, taught me everything he knew, sacrificed for me, been proud of me, and this is how I repaid him. He said he didn't understand how this had happened, how he had failed so completely as a father, that his own son would commit this ultimate betrayal. He told me I had a choice to make. I could renounce this foolishness, return to Islam and remain his son, or I could continue on this path and lose everything: my family, my home, my community, my inheritance, my name. He said if I chose to continue as a Christian, I was no longer his son. I would be dead to him. I looked at my father, this man I loved so much, and I told him I was sorry. I was sorry for the pain I was causing him. I was sorry that my decision hurt him, but I couldn't deny what I believed. I couldn't turn away from the truth I had found. He stood up slowly, his face hardening, and he said then I had made my choice, and I would have to live with the consequences. He told me I had until morning to pack my things and leave. He said I was not welcome in his house anymore, that I was not welcome in the mosque, that I was not to contact my mother or siblings. He said as far as he and everyone else were concerned, I had died. It would be better for the family to say I had died than to admit I had become a Christian. Then he left my room and closed the door behind him. I sat there in the darkness, the full weight of what had just happened crushing down on me. I had known there would be consequences, but knowing something intellectually and experiencing it emotionally are completely different things. I had just lost my family. My father had disowned me. My mother was heartbroken. My siblings would grow up being told their older brother had betrayed them. I would lose my home, my community, my entire support system. And I knew that in Cairo, being a known convert from Islam to Christianity meant I would be in real danger. But even through all that pain, even through the tears that wouldn't stop falling, I felt something else too. I felt peace. The same peace I had felt that night in the storage room when I first gave my life to Christ. It was a peace that didn't make sense given the circumstances, a peace that went beyond my understanding. I remember something I had read in the Bible, words Jesus spoke. Do not suppose that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I did not come to bring peace but a sword, for I have come to turn a man against his father, a daughter against her mother. For anyone who loves their father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Jesus had warned his followers that following him would sometimes mean family division. He had warned that the cost would be high, and he had said it would be worth it. I spent that last night in my childhood home packing a small bag with whatever I could carry. A few clothes, some documents, a little money I had saved. I couldn't take much. As I packed, I looked around my room at everything I was leaving behind. The shelf of Islamic books I had studied for years, the prayer mat I had used since I was a child, the certificate on the wall from when I won a Quran memorization competition at age 15. This had been my entire life, and now it was ending. I lay down on my bed for the last time around 3 in the morning. I couldn't sleep, but I closed my eyes and prayed. I thanked Jesus for revealing himself to me. I asked him to protect me and guide me. I asked him to soften my family's hearts, and I asked him to give me the strength to face whatever came next. When dawn came, I heard my father's alarm go off in the next room. I heard him get up for morning prayers. I heard him moving around the apartment. But he didn't come to my room. He didn't say goodbye. I picked up my bag and opened my bedroom door. The apartment was quiet. My mother was in the kitchen, her back to me. When she heard me, she turned around and our eyes met for just a moment. The pain in her face was unbearable. I wanted to run to her, to hug her, to tell her I loved her. But I knew that would only make things worse, so I just whispered that I was sorry, that I loved her. She turned away and covered her face with her hands. I walked out of the apartment, down the stairs, and into the street as the sun was starting to rise over Cairo. People were beginning to open their shops. The call to prayer echoed from the mosque where my father would soon be leading the morning prayers without me. I stood on that familiar street where I had walked thousands of times, and I realized I had nowhere to go. I had no plan, no place to stay, no real idea of what to do next. All I had was a small bag, a little money, and a faith that had cost me everything. I pulled out my phone and messaged Boutros, the man from the radio station who had been advising me. I told him what had happened and asked if he could help. He responded within minutes, telling me to go to a specific address on the other side of the city. He said there were people there who could help me, who would keep me safe. So I started walking toward the bus stop, leaving behind everything I had ever known. As I walked, people from our neighborhood who were heading to morning prayers passed by me. Some of them looked at me strangely, probably wondering why the imam's son was walking around with the bag at this hour. I wondered how long it would take for the whole community to know what I had done. Hours, days. I knew the gossip would spread like fire, knew that my name would become a scandal, a warning story that parents would tell their children about what happens when you stray from the faith. I got on a bus heading across the city. As it pulled away from my neighborhood, I looked out the window at the mosque where I had spent so much of my life. I could see my father's window from the bus, and I wondered if he was watching me leave, or if he had already begun the process of pretending I had never existed. The bus ride took almost an hour through Cairo's chaotic morning traffic. I stared out the window the whole time, watching the city pass by, thinking about how everything had changed in less than 24 hours. Yesterday, I had been the Imam's beloved son. Today, I was an outcast, a traitor, a dead man to my own family. When I reached the address Boutros had given me, I found myself in front of a simple apartment building in a neighborhood I didn't know. I knocked on the door he had specified, and a middle-aged woman answered. She looked at me kindly and said she had been expecting me. She welcomed me inside like I was a long-lost relative, not a stranger who had just shown up at her door. Her name was Mariam, and her apartment became my refuge. She and her husband were part of a secret network of believers who helped converts from Islam. They had both been Muslim once themselves years ago. They understood exactly what I was going through because they had lived it. Mariam made me tea and asked if I had eaten. I realized I hadn't eaten anything since the morning before. She prepared food while I sat at her small kitchen table, still in shock, still processing everything that had happened. That first day in her apartment, I mostly just sat in silence. I couldn't really talk about what had happened yet. The wound was too fresh, too raw. Mariam and her husband didn't push me to talk. They just let me be, let me process, let me grieve. Because that's what I was doing. I was grieving. Even though I had chosen this path, even though I knew I had found truth, I was grieving the loss of my family, my home, my entire previous life. And grief is grief, no matter how necessary the loss was. As night fell on my first day as an exile, I lay on the small couch where Mariam had made up a bed for me. I could hear the call to prayer from a nearby mosque. I thought about my father leading prayers, my family breaking their fast together, my younger siblings probably being told I was gone, and they shouldn't ask questions. And I cried for what I had lost. I cried for the pain I had caused. I cried because even though I had found truth and peace with God, the cost was so much higher than I had ever imagined. But even through the tears, even through the grief, I knew I had made the right choice. Because I had finally found what my soul had been searching for all along. I had found God not as a distant judge, but as a loving Father. I had found Jesus not just as a prophet, but as my Savior. I had found truth that set me free, even though that freedom came with a price. As I lay there in the darkness of that unfamiliar room, I remember something else I had read in the Bible. Jesus said, "Everyone who has left houses or brothers or sisters or father or mother or children or fields for my sake will receive 100 times as much and will inherit eternal life." I had left everything, and I had to trust that Jesus would be faithful to his promise, that he would give me a new family, a new purpose, a new life. I didn't know then that the story was far from over. I didn't know that God was already working in ways I couldn't see, preparing something I never could have imagined. I didn't know that my father's rejection of me would not be the end, but would actually lead to a beginning more miraculous than I could have dreamed. All I knew that night was that I had lost everything for Christ. What I didn't know yet was what Christ was about to do for my father. 3 weeks passed in that small apartment with Mariam and her husband Ahmed. Those were some of the strangest weeks of my life. On one hand, I was experiencing the freedom and joy of openly being a Christian for the first time. I could pray to Jesus without hiding. I could read my Bible in broad daylight. I could talk about my faith with people who understood. Mariam and Ahmed connected me with a small group of other believers, most of them also converts from Islam. We would meet in secret locations, worship together, study scripture together. I was discovering what it meant to be part of the body of Christ, to have brothers and sisters in faith who became a new kind of family. But on the other hand, I was constantly grieving. Every morning I would wake up and for just a moment forget what had happened, forget that I couldn't go home, and then reality would crash back down on me. I couldn't stop thinking about my family, about my mother's tears, about my younger siblings who must have been confused and hurt, about my father and how devastated he must have been. I thought about them constantly, during the day when I was trying to distract myself with reading or helping Mariam with household tasks, at night when I couldn't sleep, every time I heard the call to prayer, every time I passed a father walking with his son on the street. I prayed for them every single day, multiple times a day. I begged God to reveal himself to them the way he had revealed himself to me. I asked him to soften their hearts, to open their eyes, to help them understand. I knew it was probably impossible, knew that my father would never change his mind, but I prayed anyway because I didn't know what else to do. Boutros, my contact from the radio ministry, checked on me regularly. He was helping me figure out my next steps. The reality was that I couldn't stay in Cairo forever. As a known convert, I was in danger. There were people in our community who believed that apostates should be killed, and while Egypt was generally more tolerant than some other places, that didn't mean I was safe. Butros was working on getting me connected with organizations that help persecuted Christians, possibly getting me out of the country eventually. But I wasn't ready to leave yet, partly because I didn't have the resources to go anywhere, but mostly because leaving Egypt would mean completely giving up any hope of reconciliation with my family. As long as I was in the same city, there was still a chance, however small, that something could change. I had no way of knowing what was happening with my family. I had no contact with them. I didn't dare go anywhere near our neighborhood. All I could do was imagine and worry and pray. But what I didn't know was that my father was going through his own crisis. I learned about all of this later from my mother. But let me tell you what was happening to him during those same 3 weeks, because it's the most important part of this story. After I left, my father threw himself into his religious duties with an intensity that worried everyone around him. He spent almost all his time at the mosque. He was there before the first call to prayer each morning and wouldn't leave until late at night. He led every prayer service, gave longer sermons, organized extra Quran study sessions. It was like he was trying to prove something, to make up for the shame of having a son who converted to Christianity, to show everyone that he was still a faithful Muslim despite what I had done. But according to my mother, he was falling apart inside. He barely ate, he hardly slept. When he was home, he was silent and distant. He wouldn't talk about me at all. If my mother or siblings mentioned my name, he would leave the room. It was like he was trying to erase me from existence, to pretend I had never been born. My mother told me later that she would hear him crying at night when he thought she was asleep. She said he aged dramatically in those weeks, that he looked like a man carrying an impossible weight. He started having dreams, bad dreams that would wake him up in the middle of the night. He didn't tell anyone about them at first, but they were disturbing him deeply. Dreams where he couldn't find his way in the dark. Dreams where he was calling out but no one could hear him. Dreams where he was drowning and couldn't reach the surface. He tried to push through to maintain his routine, to keep proving his faithfulness. But something was eating away at him from the inside. It all came to a head on a Wednesday night, 21 days after I had left home. My father stayed late at the mosque that night, as he often did. Everyone else had left after the evening prayers. He was alone in the building, which he preferred during those days. He couldn't handle being around people, having to put on a strong face, having to hear their whispers and see their pitying looks. He was sitting in the main prayer hall, the space empty and quiet except for the sounds of the city filtering in from outside. He told me later that he was praying or trying to pray, but he couldn't focus. His mind kept drifting to me, to memories of my childhood, to the pride he used to feel, to the devastation of what I had done. And then, for the first time since I had left, he allowed himself to really feel the questions that had been lurking at the edges of his mind. Questions he had been suppressing because they were too dangerous to acknowledge. Why had I seemed so certain? Why had I been willing to give up everything? What had I found that could possibly be worth such a cost? And the most dangerous question of all, what if I had actually found truth? He tried to push the questions away, tried to focus on his prayers, but they wouldn't leave him alone. And sitting there in that empty mosque, he broke down completely. He put his face on the prayer mat and he cried in a way he hadn't allowed himself to cry before. Not tears of anger this time, but tears of confusion and pain and desperate seeking. My father told me later that he called out to Allah in that moment with complete honesty for maybe the first time in his life. He said he felt like a drowning man. He said he told God that he didn't understand anything anymore, that his whole world had been turned upside down, that he needed answers, that he needed help, that he needed something real. And that's when it happened. My father described it to me later, and I've thought about his words 1,000 times since then, trying to imagine what he experienced. He said that suddenly the mosque was filled with light, not the electric lights from the ceiling, but a different kind of light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. A light so bright he had to close his eyes, but he could still see it through his eyelids. He said he felt a presence in that room with him, something so powerful and overwhelming that he couldn't move, couldn't breathe, could only lie there on that prayer mat with his face to the ground. And then he heard a voice. He told me it wasn't like hearing with his ears, but like hearing in his mind and heart and soul all at once. The voice said his name, Hassan, and it said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." My father recognized those words. He had heard them before when he had studied other religions to refute them. They were words of Jesus from the Christian scriptures, but hearing them in that moment, in that way, shattered something in him. He said he tried to speak, to ask who was speaking to him, but he couldn't form words, and the presence, the voice continued. It told him that his son had not gone astray, but had found the truth. It told him that all his life he had been teaching about God, but had never truly known God. It told him to seek and he would find, to knock and the door would be opened. And then the light faded, the presence withdrew, and my father was left alone in that mosque, shaking, terrified, completely undone. He didn't know how long he lay there. Minutes, maybe an hour. His mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened. Had it been real? Had he actually experienced something supernatural, or was he having a breakdown? Was it from God, or was it from Satan trying to deceive him? But even as he tried to rationalize it away, he knew deep in his soul that what he had experienced was real, and more than that, he knew it was true. The message, as impossible and terrifying as it was, rang true in a way that nothing had ever rung true before. When he finally got up from the floor, his legs were weak. He had to hold onto the wall to steady himself as he made his way to the mosque's small office. He sat there in the darkness for a long time, his mind full of chaos and confusion. Everything he believed had just been challenged. His entire understanding of God, of truth, of faith, of his life's work. If that experience was real, if that voice was actually God speaking to him, then everything he had taught, everything he had built his life on, might be wrong. The thought was terrifying. It would mean he had spent his entire life pointing people in the wrong direction. It would mean losing his identity, his position, his purpose. It would mean admitting that his son had been right and he had been wrong. But he couldn't deny what he had experienced. He couldn't shake the feeling that God himself had just intervened in his life. He finally went home around midnight. My mother said he looked like he had seen a ghost. He wouldn't tell her what was wrong, wouldn't explain why he looked so shaken. He just went to bed and lay awake all night, staring at the ceiling. For the next 3 days, my father barely functioned. He went through the motions of leading prayers, but his sermons were short and distracted. He cancelled his usual teaching sessions. He spent hours alone in the mosque office, clearly wrestling with something, but refusing to tell anyone what it was. My mother was terrified. She thought he was having a breakdown, that the shame of what I had done was destroying him. She tried to talk to him, but he wouldn't open up. He just kept saying he needed time to think, to pray, to figure things out. What she didn't know was that my father was doing exactly what the voice had told him to do. He was seeking, he was knocking. He started reading, not Islamic texts this time, but the very book I had read. He obtained a Bible secretly, just as I had, and he began reading the Gospels, reading about Jesus, reading the words that had changed my life. He told me later that he read with his heart pounding, feeling like he was committing a terrible sin, but unable to stop. He read the same passages that had struck me so deeply. The Sermon on the Mount, the parables, the teachings about love and mercy and grace. And the more he read, the more the pieces started falling into place. He began to see why I had been so certain, why I had been willing to give up everything. He began to understand what I had found. But understanding something intellectually and accepting it personally are two very different things. My father was terrified of what this meant for him. If he admitted that Jesus was who he claimed to be, he would lose everything I had lost and more. He was older with more responsibilities, more people depending on him, more to sacrifice. He tried to find a way to reconcile what he was learning with what he had always believed. Tried to find some middle ground where he could acknowledge some truth in Christianity without fully converting. But the more he read, the more he realized that Jesus doesn't allow for middle ground. He claims to be the only way to God. Either that claim is true or it's not. There's no room for partial belief. My father told me that the breaking point came when he read the crucifixion story. He read about Jesus dying on the cross, willingly sacrificing himself, taking on the punishment for humanity's sins. He read Jesus' words from the cross, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And he thought about me, about how he had rejected me, disowned me, told me I was dead to him. And he realized that while he had shown me nothing but judgment and anger, Jesus had shown nothing but love and forgiveness, even to those who killed him. He broke down crying right there in the mosque office, the Bible open in front of him. And for the first time, he prayed not as an imam, not as a scholar, not as someone who had all the answers. He prayed as a broken man who finally realized he needed a savior. He told Jesus that he believed. He told him he was sorry for spending his life teaching people to reject him. He asked for forgiveness and mercy. He surrendered his life, his career, his reputation, everything, and asked Jesus to be his Lord. The next morning, my father did something that shocked everyone who knew about it. He told my mother that he needed to find me, that he had to talk to me, that it was urgent. My mother didn't understand. She thought maybe he wanted to try one more time to convince me to come back to Islam. But she gave him the phone number of a distant relative who lived in the neighborhood where she had heard I might be staying. She had secretly been trying to keep track of where I was, even though my father had forbidden any contact. My father tracked me down through Boutros. He called the radio station number from the business card I had left behind in my room. He explained who he was, and after some understandable hesitation, Boutros gave him the address where I was staying. I had no idea any of this was happening. As far as I knew, my father still hated me, still considered me dead. I was still praying for him every day, but I had no real hope that anything would change. So you can imagine my shock when Mariam came to tell me that my father was at the door asking to see me. My first thought was panic. Had he come to hurt me, to drag me back home? Was he here with other men from the mosque? I thought about running, hiding, refusing to see him, but Mariam told me he was alone. She said he didn't look angry. She said he looked broken and humble, and he had been standing outside for 20 minutes, working up the courage to knock. My hands were shaking as I walked to the door. I hadn't seen my father in 3 weeks, and those 3 weeks felt like 3 years. When I opened the door and saw him standing there, I barely recognized him. He had lost weight, his face was haggard, his eyes were red. He looked like a man who had been through hell. We stood there looking at each other for a moment that felt frozen in time, and then he spoke, his voice quiet and cracking. He said he needed to know what I had found. He said something had happened to him, something he couldn't explain. He said he thought he had encountered the same truth that had changed my life. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't process what I was hearing. Was this real? Was this some kind of trick? Or was this actually the answer to 3 weeks of desperate prayers? I invited him in. We sat down in Mariam's small living room, and my father told me everything about the light in the mosque, about the voice, about reading the Bible in secret, about Jesus breaking through all his defenses and reaching his heart. And then, with tears streaming down his face, my father told me he believed. He said he understood now. He said he was sorry for how he had treated me. He said I had been right and he had been wrong. I couldn't hold back anymore. I started crying too. 3 weeks of pain and grief and loss came pouring out, and then I was hugging my father, and he was hugging me back, and we were both sobbing like children. My father had come looking for his son, but what he found was so much more. He found a savior, he found truth, he found real faith for the first time in his life. And in that moment, sitting in that small living room, both of us crying, I witnessed the most powerful miracle I've ever seen. Not the supernatural light in the mosque, as amazing as that was. The real miracle was seeing my father's heart transformed by the same love that had transformed mine. God had answered my prayers in a way more powerful than I ever could have imagined. The first thing my father and I did after that reunion was pray together. Not the ritualistic prayers we had prayed together hundreds of times before, not words in Arabic that we had memorized, but real, honest prayer. We sat in that small living room and we talked to Jesus like he was right there with us, because he was. My father stumbled over his words, unsure how to pray this new way, and it was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. He thanked Jesus for pursuing him, for not giving up on him, for breaking through his hardness and pride. He asked for wisdom for what came next, because he knew his decision would have consequences just as devastating as mine had been. And he prayed for my mother, for my siblings, for our community. When we finished praying, we just sat there for a while trying to process everything that had happened. 3 weeks ago, my father had told me I was dead to him. Now we were brothers in Christ. The complete impossibility of it overwhelmed both of us, but reality began to set in quickly. My father asked me not to tell anyone yet about his conversion. He needed time to think, to prepare, to figure out how to handle this situation. He had to consider my mother, my siblings, his position at the mosque, the community that depended on him. Unlike me, he couldn't just disappear. He had responsibilities, people counting on him, a much more complicated life to untangle. I understood. Though part of me worried, I knew how difficult it was to live a double life. To hide your faith, I knew the pressure and the pain of it. But I also knew this was his journey, and he had to walk it at his own pace. Over the next week, my father came to visit me almost every day. He would tell my mother he had errands to run or meetings to attend. We would sit in Mariam's apartment for hours, reading the Bible together, talking about Jesus, asking questions, processing everything. It was strange and wonderful, this role reversal where I was now teaching my father the things I had learned. He devoured the scriptures the same way I had. He had so many questions, so much he wanted to understand. We would read a passage and then spend an hour discussing it, comparing it to what we had both been taught in Islam, marveling at the differences. One afternoon, we were reading Romans chapter 5 about how we have peace with God through Jesus Christ. My father stopped and looked up at me with tears in his eyes. He said he finally understood what I meant about the emptiness, about the distance from God. He said for the first time in his life, he felt actual peace with God, not just fear and obligation. We also talked about the practical realities we were facing. We were both Christians now, but we were also still in Cairo, still surrounded by a community that would see our faith as the worst kind of betrayal. My father was trying to figure out what to do. Could he continue as Imam while being a secret Christian? The idea was absurd and dishonest, but leaving his position would mean disaster for our family. During one of these conversations, I asked him about my mother. Did she know where he was going? Did she suspect anything? He told me she knew something had changed in him. The angry, broken man from the previous weeks had been replaced by someone quieter, more thoughtful. She had noticed him reading books he wouldn't show her, spending time in deep thought, asking strange questions. She was worried but also confused. I asked him if he thought she might be open to hearing about Jesus. He wasn't sure. My mother was a devout Muslim, but she was also a woman who followed her heart. She had been devastated by my conversion, but she had never stopped loving me. He thought that if anyone might understand, it would be her. After much prayer and discussion, my father decided he needed to tell her, not just about his own conversion, but about everything. About his experience in the mosque, about what he had been learning, about meeting with me. He couldn't keep living this lie, especially not with his own wife. He chose a Friday evening to talk to her after my siblings were asleep. I waited at Mariam's apartment, praying constantly, terrified of how my mother might react. Would she report my father to the religious authorities? Would she leave him? Would this destroy what was left of our family? My father called me late that night. His voice sounded exhausted but also relieved. He told me it had been one of the hardest conversations of his life. But my mother hadn't reacted the way he feared. She had listened to everything he told her about the light in the mosque, about the voice, about reading the Bible and meeting with me, about accepting Jesus. She hadn't shouted or cried or threatened to leave. She had just sat there absorbing it all, asking occasional questions. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said something that surprised both of them. She said she had been having dreams too, dreams about light, about someone calling her name. She had been afraid to mention them because they frightened her and she didn't understand them. She told him she had been angry at me for converting, but she had also been curious. What had I found that was worth losing everything? She had secretly wondered if there was something to Christianity that she didn't understand. Something that could make two people she loved willing to sacrifice so much. She didn't convert that night. She wasn't ready. But she told my father she wanted to know more. She wanted to read the Bible herself. She wanted to understand. My father was overwhelmed with gratitude. This was more than he had hoped for. Even if she didn't ultimately believe, at least she was willing to explore, to ask questions, to keep an open heart. He brought her to see me 2 days later. Walking through that door and seeing my mother again after nearly a month apart was almost too much for me to handle. She looked tired and sad, but when she saw me, her face crumpled and she opened her arms. I ran to her and we held each other, both of us crying. She told me she had missed me every single day. She said not having me in the house felt like missing a limb. She said she loved me regardless of what I believed, and she was sorry for how everything had happened. Then she said she wanted to understand. She wanted me to explain to her what I had found, what had changed me so completely that I was willing to lose my family for it. So I told her my story, everything, the questions I had started having, the emptiness I felt finding the radio broadcast, reading the Bible the night I gave my life to Christ. I told her about the peace I had found, the relationship with God I had always longed for, the love that cast out fear. She listened carefully, asking questions, sometimes looking skeptical, sometimes looking moved. When I finished, she asked if she could borrow my Bible. She said she needed to read it for herself to see what we were seeing. Over the next few weeks, both my parents came to visit me regularly. We studied together, prayed together, talked for hours about faith and truth and what it all meant. My father was growing stronger in his faith every day, becoming more convinced, more at peace. My mother was still wrestling, still questioning, but I could see something changing in her too. About 3 weeks after my father first came to see me, my mother made her decision. We were sitting together one evening, the three of us, reading through the Gospel of John. We got to chapter 11, the story of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. When we finished reading, my mother was crying. She said she believed. She said she didn't fully understand everything yet, but she knew in her heart that Jesus was real, that he was who he claimed to be, that he was the answer she had been searching for, without even knowing she was searching. We prayed together, the three of us, my mother giving her life to Christ. And in that moment, I experienced a joy I didn't know was possible. My entire family, the family I thought I had lost forever, was being restored, not just not restored but transformed, brought together in a faith that was real and deep and life-changing. But our joy was mixed with the knowledge of what we still had to face. My siblings still didn't know anything about what was happening. My father was still serving as imam, living a lie every time he led prayers in the mosque. We couldn't keep this secret forever, and we all knew it. The situation came to a head about 2 months after my father's conversion. He couldn't continue leading Islamic prayers while being a Christian. The internal conflict was tearing him apart. Every Friday when he stood before the congregation to deliver his sermon, he felt like a fraud. He knew he had to step down, but doing so would require an explanation, and any explanation would lead to disaster. After much prayer and discussion, my father decided on honesty. He would resign from his position as imam and tell the mosque leadership the truth about why. He knew it would mean persecution, financial hardship, possibly danger, but he couldn't live a lie anymore. He asked the mosque board to meet with him on a Thursday afternoon. He told them he was resigning effective immediately. When they asked why, he took a deep breath and told them the truth. He said he had come to believe that Jesus Christ was the Son of God and the only way to salvation. He said he could no longer serve as an imam because he was now a follower of Jesus. The reaction was explosive. The men in that room erupted in anger and disbelief. They accused him of being insane, of being deceived by demons, of bringing unbearable shame to the mosque and community. They said he had betrayed everything he stood for, that he was worse than his son because he should have known better. One of the board members physically pushed him, calling him a traitor and an infidel. Others shouted that he deserved death for apostasy. My father stood there and took it all, praying silently for strength, for peace, for protection. Eventually, they ordered him to leave the mosque and never return. They said his employment was terminated immediately, that he would receive no final payment, no benefits, nothing. They said they would be informing the community about his apostasy, and he should expect consequences. My father walked out of that mosque for the last time with nothing but his dignity and his faith. When he got home and told my mother what had happened, they both knew their lives had just changed forever. The news spread through our neighborhood within hours. The imam had become a Christian. The scandal was even bigger than when I had converted, because my father had been a religious leader, a teacher, someone people trusted. His conversion felt like a betrayal on a much larger scale. Within days, we faced the full force of community persecution. People threw stones at our apartment windows. Someone spray-painted offensive words on our door. My father received death threats. Store owners refused to serve my mother. My siblings were bullied mercilessly at school, called the children of an apostate. The financial situation became desperate quickly. My father had no job, and no one in the community would hire him. We had some savings, but they wouldn't last long. We couldn't stay in the apartment much longer, because the landlord was pressuring us to leave. My parents made the difficult decision to pull my younger siblings out of school. They gathered the children together and explained everything. They told them about becoming Christians, about why they had made this choice, about what it meant for the family. They gave my siblings the choice to reject them if they wanted, to go live with relatives who were still Muslim, to distance themselves from this scandal. But my siblings, even the youngest ones, chose to stay with us. They didn't all understand what was happening. They didn't all convert right away, but they chose family over community, chose to face persecution alongside us rather than abandon us. Butros and the Christian network that had been helping me stepped in to help my family. They found us a small apartment in a different part of Cairo, far from our old neighborhood. It was cramped and modest, but it was safe. They connected my father with some work opportunities, small jobs that wouldn't pay much but would help us survive. They introduced us to a secret house church where we could worship with other believers without fear. Those first few months after my father's resignation were incredibly difficult. We went from being a respected family in our community to being outcasts with almost nothing. We had lost our home, my father's career, our social network, our sense of security. We were starting over from scratch, but we had each other and we had Jesus, and somehow that was enough. I moved back in with my family in our new apartment. After being separated for months, being reunited with them was a gift I never thought I would receive. Yes, our circumstances were difficult. Yes, we struggled financially and faced ongoing threats, but we were together and we were free to worship openly in our own home. We started having family devotions every evening. We would read the Bible together, pray together, sing worship songs quietly, so the neighbors wouldn't hear. My younger siblings started asking questions about faith, started reading the scriptures for themselves. Within 6 months, all of them had made the decision to follow Christ as well. Our entire family, everyone under our roof, was now Christian. It was a miracle beyond anything I could have imagined when I first gave my life to Jesus. The transformation in my father was remarkable. The man who had been so rigid, so focused on rules and reputation, had become gentle and humble. He often said that he had spent his whole life as an imam teaching people about God, but he had never actually known God until he met Jesus. Now his faith was real, personal, filled with joy despite our circumstances. He started using his Islamic knowledge for evangelism. He would have conversations with other Muslims using his deep understanding of the Quran and Hadiths to point to Jesus. He knew all the arguments they would make because he used to make them himself, and he knew how to gently, respectfully challenge them to consider that maybe Jesus was more than just a prophet. My mother blossomed in her faith too. She joined a women's Bible study with other female converts. She found particular comfort in reading about the women in Jesus' life, how he treated them with dignity and value in a culture that often didn't. She said following Jesus made her feel seen and loved in a way she never had before. About 8 months after my father's resignation, we made the difficult decision that we needed to leave Egypt. The threats against us weren't stopping. My father had been physically attacked once when someone recognized him on the street. We were constantly looking over our shoulders, constantly afraid, and we wanted our younger siblings to have a chance at a normal life, to go to school, to grow up without constant fear. Through the Christian organizations helping us, we applied for asylum in another country. I can't tell you which country for security reasons, but it's far from Egypt, far from the only home we had ever known. The process took over a year of waiting, of uncertainty, of continuing to live in difficult circumstances. But finally we received approval. We would be allowed to resettle as religious refugees. Leaving Egypt was one of the hardest things we have ever done. Despite everything that had happened, it was still our home. It was where we were born, where our memories were made, where our language and culture and history lived. We were leaving behind extended family members, even though most of them had rejected us. We were leaving behind everything familiar, but we were also leaving behind the persecution and fear. We were going to a place where we could worship openly, where my siblings could go to school without being bullied, where my father could use his gifts without hiding. The day we left Cairo, we took one last look at the city from the airplane window. I thought about everything that had happened in less than 2 years, how my simple questions had led to such a dramatic transformation, how my family had gone from being respected members of a Muslim community to being exiled Christian refugees. It had cost us everything: our home, our community, our security, our old lives. But we had gained something infinitely more valuable. We had gained truth, we had gained real faith, we had gained Jesus. Now we are here in this new country, starting over once again. My father is studying to become a pastor so he can serve the body of Christ the way he once served the mosque. My mother is learning the language of our new home, making friends in the local church. My siblings are in school, adjusting to a completely different culture, but safe and thriving. As for me, I'm finishing my education and working with ministries that help other converts from Islam. I get to use my story, my experience, to encourage others who are going through what I went through. I get to tell them that yes, the cost is high, but Jesus is worth it, always worth it. We still have family in Egypt who won't speak to us. We still face challenges and struggles in our new life. We still sometimes feel the pain of everything we lost, but we have never, not even for a moment, regretted our decision to follow Christ. People sometimes ask me if I would do it again, knowing what it would cost. If I had known that becoming a Christian would mean losing everything, being rejected by my father, putting my whole family through persecution and exile, would I still have made the same choice? The answer is yes, 1,000 times yes, because I know what it feels like to be empty, to go through all the religious motions while feeling nothing inside. And I know what it feels like to be filled, to have real relationship with God, to experience love that casts out fear. I know what it was like to live in darkness, always wondering if I was good enough, always afraid of judgment, always distant from God. And I know what it's like to live in light, knowing I am fully known and fully loved, knowing my salvation is secure, knowing God is not far away, but is right here with me. I gave up my comfortable life, my family's approval, my community's respect, my home, my security, and in return I gained everything that truly matters. I gained truth, I gained peace, I gained eternal life, I gained Jesus. There's a verse in the Bible, in Philippians, that says to know Christ and to share in his sufferings, to become like him in his death, is gain. That used to sound crazy to me. How can suffering be gain? How can loss be gain? But now I understand, because knowing Jesus is worth more than anything else, more than comfort, more than approval, more than safety, more than earthly family, more than anything this world can offer. Jesus said that whoever loses his life for his sake will find it. I lost everything I thought made up my life, and I found real life, beautiful, abundant life, eternal life. If you are listening to this and you are a Muslim who is questioning, who is searching, who feels that same emptiness I once felt, I want you to know that Jesus is real. He is who He says He is. The Bible is true, and if you seek Him with your whole heart, you will find Him, just like I did, just like my father did. Yes, following Jesus might cost you everything. It probably will, but I promise you He is worth it. If you are listening to this and you are a Christian, I want to encourage you to pray for Muslims, to love Muslims, to share Jesus with Muslims gently and respectfully. Don't underestimate the power of prayer. I was prayed for by people I never met, people listening to that radio broadcast who prayed for Muslims to encounter Christ, and God answered those prayers. And pray for Muslim background believers who are suffering persecution right now. Pray for those who are living in secret, terrified to tell their families. Pray for those who have been rejected and cast out. Pray for those who are in danger. We need your prayers. We need the global body of Christ to remember us, to support us, to stand with us. To everyone listening, regardless of your faith background, I want to leave you with this. Truth exists, and it's worth seeking. Don't be content with religion that doesn't satisfy your soul. Don't be satisfied with going through the motions. Don't accept a relationship with God based on fear and obligation. God is not distant. He is not waiting to punish you. He is pursuing you with love. He proved that love by sending His Son to die for you. Jesus died to bring you close to God, to give you peace, to offer you forgiveness as a free gift, not something you have to earn. All you have to do is receive it. Believe that Jesus is who He says He is. Surrender your life to Him. Accept His sacrifice on your behalf, and He will transform you from the inside out, just like He transformed me and my father. I sit here today, thousands of miles from Cairo, in a place I never imagined I would live. And I am filled with gratitude for God's mercy in revealing Himself to me, gratitude for His faithfulness in restoring my family, gratitude for the suffering we endured because it brought us closer to Him, gratitude for the new life we have been given. My name is Mustafa Ali Farouk. I was the son of an imam. I was raised to be a good Muslim, and by God's grace I found Jesus Christ, and He changed everything. I lost my old life, but I gained eternal life, and I would do it all again in a heartbeat, because Jesus is worth everything. He was worth more than family, more than home, more than comfort, more than safety, more than life itself. He is the way, the truth, and the life, and I have found Him to be exactly that. My prayer is that you would find Him too, that you would experience His love, His peace, His transformation, that you would know Him, not just know about Him. Seek Him. He is not far from any of us. Knock on the door, and it will be open to you. Ask, and you will receive. This is my story. This is my testimony. This is what Jesus Christ has done in my life and in my family. And He wants to do the same for you. Whatever it costs, He is worth it, always.